Hey art nerds, happy Halloween. I am recording this right in the middle of Hurricane Zeta. I'm sitting safe in my home in Norco watching the rain come down and recording some audio. So I wanted to create a couple of witch pieces for Halloween. Usually I don't have time to do Halloween stuff because I'm so busy doing Lilliputian Living. And while I am still working on Lilliputian Living, I really wanted to do something for Halloween this year. So I'm going to show you how to ink and color this super cute witch illustration. With this piece, I wanted her to be so cute that it would basically rot your teeth out. Just super adorable Daisy Kingdom vibes. So early 90s kind of pastel floral aesthetic. I'm going to have all of the colors that I used with all the brands I used down in the description below, as well as links to where you can purchase the line art for this. If you're an art nerd, you get the line art for free. So we're starting off with inking, and I'm inking using Tombow Fudenosuke brush pens in various colors. Pink and red and blue and a little bit of green and purple and a little bit of black. And what this does is this gives us kind of a colorful base to begin with. So the whole thing about doing colored line art, if you're doing it before you ink the piece, because in a lot of my lineless art tutorials, I actually ink after. But if you're doing it before you ink the piece, you really need to know what colors in general you want things to be. So before I even started inking this piece, I sat down with a Post-it note and I figured out what I wanted everything to be so I could select the ink color closest to that. So what this does is, while it adjusts the contrast a little bit, it doesn't adjust the contrast as much as if you had used black ink. Black ink can, in many ways, deaden a piece. And when you're doing alcohol marker art and illustration, a lot of what you want is that vibrance and that liveliness that the alcohol markers can offer. And using colored inks like these allows you to maintain that. These are waterproof and alcohol marker proof, but you are going to want to allow them to cure onto the paper for at least 10 minutes. I let them cure overnight to 24 hours before I even erase the graphite underneath. I started with a penciled illustration. I went over my blue lines and I changed a few things and I tightened a few things up. And partially I penciled this so that you guys can see it better, because I know blue lines do not show up super well on camera. But it also kind of gave me a chance to warm up and to fix a few things. So with the flowers, I'm focusing mostly on using pink and then shading them, going back over and adding a little bit of purple to imply some shadow and to imply some depth. The center of the poppies I'm inking with black because those are going to be a dark gray to black color. And then on the leaves, I'm using green, and then I'm going over it where it would be shaded with blue. So you can be as detailed or as simple as you want when you're doing colored line arts. It can just be straight flat colors if you want, like you wouldn't have to go back and shade if you don't want to. Or you could shade with multiple layers. You could even do like yellow on the leaves first, then green, and then blue as things get progressively more in shadow. It's really up to you. I did kind of a middle range for this since the Tombow Fudenosuke doesn't have the largest color range. I have implored them in many videos to add more colors. And in fact, I actually end up using one of the new neon colors, the neon blue, to do the quote-unquote white on her transparent sleeves. So for her hair, I already decided that I wanted to go with a really light brown, like a fawn color. So I'm using the brown Fudenosuke for her hair. And for her skin, I really had trouble deciding between whether I wanted to use brown for her skin or pink for her skin. But I decided to go ahead and use pink for her skin because that does add a little bit more vibrancy to the colors we're using. And then to shade our brown, I went ahead and I used a black Sakura Pigma Pigma. I'm also doing what I call open eyelashes this time. It's because she's got light colored eyelashes and I wanted to indicate that rather than using what I usually would use, which would be heavy lines, either heavy colored lines or heavy black lines to imply eyelashes. I'm also working larger than I normally work, and I gotta tell you guys, I love it. I think I work too small. I am working on Strathmore 300 series Bristol, smooth Bristol. So, you know, a very affordable paper, heavier weight, a little heavier than cardstock, but works so well with alcohol markers. You can really get a lot of blending, and there's not so much texture that it drains your markers dry, but it's still a very affordable and accessible paper that you can find almost anywhere. So this illustration is, it's kind of around 8.5 by 11. Like I said, drawing her and the cat, they're a little bit larger than I would normally work. And I really like that because it actually was easier to do. When I work smaller because generally I make comics, and I'm making comics on an 11 by 15 piece of watercolor paper. And when you subdivide that by like 5 panels, you start having to work pretty small. So I'm just used to working smaller. But for standalone illustrations, you can work bigger and you can zoom in. And it's easier than sometimes trying to get all these little fiddly details into a really small space. You have more room to kind of branch out and more room to kind of play around with the color and allow the colors to blend. So I will definitely be working larger sometimes in the future because it was just such a different experience for me. I know this sounds like a big duh, but like I said, I'm normally a comic artist and I usually work in a very specific way. So for the cat, I was really stuck between whether I wanted to do a white cat or if I wanted to do a black cat because she is a witch. So I decided to go with a black cat. And if you guys know me, you know I love black cats. My first cat, Midnight, was a black cat, and she was my best friend growing up. And they're kind of a lucky omen for me. Now, when I'm adopting animals, I basically let the animal, the cat, pick me. I don't go out ever specifically seeking a particular color of cat or breed of cat. It's whatever cat really just meshes well with me at the time. And my current cat, Bowie, is a gray cat, so he's somewhere in between the two. And I did think about doing a gray cat in the middle of coloring the cat, but you know, I really wanted to honor Midnight at that point, so I decided to just go ahead and color the cat black. So now that it's been inked, I'm going to allow it to cure overnight, and then I'm going to erase the graphite using a white vinyl eraser. And I find that white vinyl erasers like the Pentel high polymer eraser or the Tombow mono erasers don't cause as much ghosting. They don't cause my ink to lift off the paper as much as, say, you know, like a pink pearl eraser might. So I was afraid that the graphite would discolor the colored links a whole lot, but I was able to get most of the graphite up from underneath the inks without too much ghosting. So I went ahead and I scanned the line art at this stage, and like I said, it's available down in the description below. You can buy it on Gumroad, or if you're one of my art nerds on Patreon, you get the line art for this for free. So for just $2 a month, you could get all sorts of behind-the-scenes goodies for free. And you can join me at patreon.com/natosoup. I'll have a link to that in the description below as well. All right, so the colors that we're using today come from across the marker spectrum. Then I spent a long time swatching out my colors and then carefully selecting which ones I want. And the way I do that is I number them 1, 2, and 3, 1 being the base, 2 being the midtone, and 3 being the shadow color. Sometimes I go all the way up to 4. And I tried to keep it organized by like skin, blush, hair, eyes, her dress, the flowers, etc. Not only for your reference, but for my reference. So I wanted to create a background on this, and I'm taping it off so we get a nice clean edge rather than a more soft or a less organized edge. And I'm using just a little bit of inexpensive washi tape, and I applied it to my arm first just to remove some of the tack so it doesn't tear up the paper. So for the base color on her eyes, I started with B00 in Copic and then B00. So two really, really light blues. And then I moved on to PB60, which is, as you can see, a purple, PB171, a slightly darker purple, PB127, an even darker purple, and then V54, a sketch marker, and it's kind of a reddish purple color. And I'm basically just using whatever colors seem to work for this, whatever brands seem to work for this. So this is a true testament of marker compatibility because we've got Copics, we've got Prismacolors, we've got sketch markers, which I recently reviewed, and that review will come out to the public soon, but my Artnerds already have it. We're using Shinhan Twin Touch markers, and I think that's all we've got. Nope, no, there's some Neo Pico colors in there too, I think. So I was really just looking for the best colors possible for this. So I wanted to create kind of like a misty or a cloudy abstract purple and pink background. So I am using PB60, which is the base color on the eyes, PB171, which is the second darker color, the colorless blender, and I started with a Copic colorless blender, but it wasn't juicy enough, so I switched over to a Blick Studio colorless blender, and I'm also using some Blick Studio brush markers in this, if you guys can't tell, as well as rubbing alcohol in a spritz bottle. And then the pinky pink color that I'm using here would be, this is a sketch marker, and it's like ice pearl, and I'm trying to find the color for it. I had such good notes everywhere else, and this is the one that I don't have good notes for, so my apologies, but it is like ice pearl, and I think it's like R34. And all I'm doing is I'm applying some of the base purple, so that would be PB60, and then maybe layering in a little bit of PB171, occasionally mixing in some of the R34, yes, I found it. I don't know why I lost it. And then either blending it out with a colorless blender, or later on, once this is more complete, I'm going to try to break up the forms even more by using some rubbing alcohol. So this is a technique that takes a lot of patience, and now's a good time to tell you guys that this video has been time-lapsed several times over. So for example, this individual chunk, when I had stitched it all together, was about an hour long, and I've managed to crunch it down into about 4.5 minutes. So that should give you guys some indication of just how long I spent. I spent 2 days on this illustration, and while I really enjoyed working on it, I'm not complaining. I just wanted to be honest about the amount of time it takes to make this sort of thing, because one of the things that I hear a lot of my younger students and even some of my older students complain about, they kind of mourn the fact that they feel like they're slow at making art. And I think a lot of that comes from, you know, watching time-lapse videos where it's not clear that it's been time-lapsed. So I always try to disclose that. All right, so I masked off her eyes and I spritzed a little bit of rubbing alcohol into the background, and what that's going to do is it's going to push some of the color to the back of the paper and kind of model it, kind of break that up a little bit. And then I wanted some larger chaos going on, so I dripped some rubbing alcohol on as well. Once that dried, I carefully removed our washi tape border, as you guys can see here. So next, for the cat's eyes, I wanted to go with blue eyes because I wanted this to be an illustration that was just so cute. It was a little bit creepy. It started giving like manipulation vibes. So I thought a blue-eyed black cat would be very, very cute. So I started with PB202. then B32 in Copic, and then PB244. And PB indicates Prismacolor brush markers. For the cat's bow, I'm using similar colors. I'm using Copic B32. Then I'm going in with PB244, and then I'm layering B24 on top of that. So for her skin, I wanted something that felt a little anime fake, if you guys know what I mean. Like that overly peachy color that you sometimes get with anime art rather than the more beigey kind of colors you can get. So I started with PB24, which is a Prismacolor. And I'm utilizing my overblending technique here where we're using the white of the paper as some of our base color. And you guys can find out more about my overblending technique in my Unicorn Girl tutorial, which is coming up soon. So I'm working in stages here. And after I finished applying the PB24, I applied O25, which is a sketch marker, and then BR24, which is also a sketch marker. Then for the blush, I went in with 079, which is a Blick marker. It's a really light, peachy, sort of blushy color. Then E93, which is Tea Rose in Copic, so that's a little bit darker version of the same color. And then much later on, I went in with RV42 in Copic, which is kind of a red-violet color, but it's more like a salmon-y red-violet, very light. So I want her sleeves to appear translucent, and one of the ways you can imply translucency is by showing some of the color underneath, but obscuring some of the detail. So I went ahead and I blocked in some of her skin with PB24, our base skin tone. So alcohol markers are a lot like watercolor, where you can get wet into wet blending, which is a very soft diffused blend, and you can get wet over dry layering, where you get harsher transitions. So I went ahead and added E11, which is a much darker, pinker sort of skin tone color in Copic, to start putting in some of the skin shadows. Now for her hat, I'm blocking it in with PB202. So it's the same very light blue that we used in the cat's eyes. I'm trying to work with kind of a limited color palette here. You know, pinks, blues, and purples, and that's about it. And then I layered B32 on top of it. And I want the underside of the brim to be darker, but to catch just a little bit of light around the outer rim. And then I want the cone part of her witch's hat to be lighter, like it's really catching the light. And when I color with markers, I don't worry too much about streakiness because I work in multiple layers and they tend to blend out as I layer. So after I finished with B32, I'm going in with PB244, and I wanted really warm blues for this. So that's why I ended up using a lot of Prismacolors. In fact, I use a lot of Prismacolors in this piece because I often find that Prismacolor has these like really saturated poppy colors that I don't really get with Copic. So that's why I have a fairly sizable Prismacolor collection, is it kind of accents my Copic collection and gives me a wider range of the sort of colors that I might want to use for a piece like this. So once I'm done with PB244, I layer on B24, and then I start the ribbon. And I'm starting the ribbon with P60, and then I go over it with PB171, so a darker purple. And I'm using an ultramarine blue. I missed the color number for that, I apologize. But it is Copic's ultramarine blue and a Copic original. And I'm blending that out with B26, so a lighter blue color that just kind of helps soften the transition, because I definitely wanted more contrast in the hat. I wanted to imply more shadow. So for the poppies, I really wanted to do those sort of like dusty pink poppies that are very popular in wedding bouquets. And they have kind of an ombre effect where it seems like they go from darker to light. So I'm starting with PB209, which is a really, really light pink. I'm then blending it out using the colorless blender. So I'm not going all the way to the center of the flower. I'm going about halfway and then blending it out with the colorless blender. And then while that's still wet, I'm going in with R34, which is a sketch marker. And I'm applying it just kind of to the edges of each petal and then blending that back out with the PB209. And while it's a very time-consuming technique, you get these really, really soft blends, and it just feels more, looks more painterly, I think. So for the center of the poppies, I didn't want to do straight black. So I start with V54, which is a sketch marker. It's a light violet color. Then I use Ranger Eggplant, which I've put into a sketch marker. And I have a video about using Ranger and Pinata inks in your Copic sketch markers. So it's like a really nice darker purple. And then finally I go in with C10, and I work very quickly wet into wet so those colors will diffuse into one another. So for the roses, I wanted something a little more saturated and a little more pinky, something closer to the color that I'm going to use for her dress. And I started with the petals. And I began with R32, leaving some of the white on the flower. Then I go in with R43 just to kind of help capture some of the shadow. And then finally I go in with PB8. And I'm doing the same thing now with the petals on the roses themselves. And like with the poppies, on some of the larger petals, I'm leaving some of the white of the flower and then blending it a bit with the colorless blender. And this is another one where I'm trying to work as quickly as possible so I can take advantage of the wet into wet blending you can achieve with alcohol markers. This is one of the reasons I like working on heavier papers like Bristol rather than coated marker papers where everything just kind of sits on the surface, is you can get these really soft diffused blends. So I have this technique for dual wielding and tri-wielding markers that I'm not really able to show on camera because pulling the caps off and putting the caps back on shakes my camera. And basically I hold 3 markers in one hand. They're kind of spaced between the fingers, and I just alternate like that. And it allows me to work quickly, but it does cause a fair amount of hand fatigue. So as I was coloring in the flowers, I decided I wanted to make her lips a little bit pinker. So I used R43 just to add a little, well no, actually R32, so the lightest pink on the roses, to add a little bit extra color onto her lips, and then I went over that with R43. So for the leaves of the roses, I'm using a yellow green, a very bright chartreuse yellow green as my base, and then I'm going in with kind of a teal blue green. So I'm starting with YG01, then I'm applying BG13 to the shadows, and then I'm blending back out with our yellow green just to kind of soften that transition, and you get this really vibrant green. I really like the green in this. For the poppy leaves, I wanted something more true green, so I used G17 and G28 from Copic. And then for the button on her dress, I used the same blues that I used to start the eyes, and then I just drew a little rose in Prismacolor. So for her hair, like I mentioned earlier, I wanted a really light fawn brown. It's a color I don't do too often, but I love it, especially like in wigs. It's such a cute color. So I'm starting with PB201. As you can see, it's a Prismacolor color, and usually I would use this as a skin tone, but it's working really well as a hair color here. And I'm really utilizing the brush not only to fill large areas quickly, but to also capture the shine in her hair. And you see I already applied some underneath her sleeve just to help imply that translucency. And then while that's drying, I'm just going back over and adding a little bit more E93 or flesh tint to her cheeks just to kind of increase the blushiness. So I am layering the same color again, our PB201, on top of our original layer. As I've mentioned in some of my other alcohol marker tutorials, you can often get 3 layers of color, 3 layers of tone out of each marker. So if you're trying to develop depth or if you're trying to cover streakiness, this is a great way to do that. And I apologize for all the dinging going on in the background. My husband went and plugged his phone in since we're in the middle of a hurricane, and he did not set it to silent. So if that is annoying for you guys, I apologize. It doesn't bother me, but I have gotten comments before that those kind of noises can be distracting. So the next color I'm using is another Prismacolor, PB95, and I'm trying to cover less in this layer than in the layer prior, and I'm trying to really let the brush do its work. And by that I mean I'm using decreasing pressure on my brush strokes to kind of create this illusion of light hitting the hair. And the same as with the prior layer, I'm doing another layer of PB95 after that first layer dried, developing the color. Because when you're blending alcohol markers, when you're layering alcohol markers, like with watercolor, dry over wet gives you a stronger delineation of color rather than wet over wet, where the color kind of diffuses into one another. Next, we're going in with PB65, so slightly darker, and I've also started coloring in the eyelashes, and I'm trying to leave a highlight on the eyelashes as well, just so that it doesn't become just one solid color. And at this point, I'm mostly focusing on kind of rendering the form and also creating depth and shadow. So for her hair, I've used each marker twice, and that allows me to really build up color depth and additional color. It also hides some of the streakiness, and it just kind of creates a more full appearance. So for her transparent sleeves, we are starting with B0000, so the same really light blue that we used on her eyes, and we're gonna just apply that basically everywhere there's going to be shadow. Then while I wait for that to dry, I'm starting in on the bow in the back, and I'm using the same colors that I used on her hat and on the cat's bows. So I'm trying to repeat these colors, trying to echo these colors. Once my first application has dried on the sleeves, I'm using B00, and I'm going to just kind of work back and forth, maybe adding back a little bit more of the local color, blending it back a little bit more until I get the transparency that I want. For the cat's ears, I'm starting with Blick 079, so it's that peachy blushy color, and then I'm applying E93. And then I'm starting in on the base of the dress, and I'm using R34, so that ice pearl color in sketch marker, for the majority of the base of the dress. And I should have left the washi tape on because I would have gotten a cleaner line there. Mostly I was just using the washi tape to kind of create a border on the background, and then I didn't really think much of it when I removed it. And I'm applying a second layer of the same R34, and you guys can really see how you get 2 tones out of the same color. In fact, I went in for a 3rd tone of that color, so we get the 3 layers that I talked about. Now, if you're working with a limited marker selection, fear not, I've got loads of tutorials to help you guys make the most of what you've got, as well as how to work with inexpensive to downright cheap markers. And this tutorial, I don't expect you to follow it perfectly. It's really more just inspiration and to kind of hang out. So the next color on the dress was R81, which looks more fluorescent than it actually is. And at this stage, I'm going to start freehanding these large and small roses. So I start with R81 and do big pink roses, and then I go in with, I think it's like PB171 to do the smaller. Actually, I have the exact colors. So I use RV04 as my first rose color, then PB344 for the second, Then for the leaves, we use YG01, and then we layer BG13 on top of that. Now for the pearls, I really wanted to capture iridescence. So I started with B0000, our really light blue. Then I went in with R34, so that's the pinky color from the dress. Then O25, which is kind of an orangey color from Sketch Marker. Then PB60. Then I applied B00 to kind of shade the pearls at the bottom. And then for a little bit more shadow, B32. For the cat, we're doing a black cat, and when I render anything that's black, but particularly like black fur, I want to also capture the highlights. So that means I want to start with like a mid-tone. So I'm starting with C3, a cool gray from Copic, as kind of the base color. And that will allow me to have some highlights that aren't like the white of the paper highlights. Now for the cat's paw, I use E39. And then I apply C8, which is a much darker cool gray, on top of our original layer of C3. So as I was coloring in the fur, I decided I wanted to go over the pink of the ears and the paw pads with a gray, since Bowie, my gray cat, has pinky gray paw pads and Midnight had pinky gray paw pads rather than just like pink. So once I finished rendering in the fur and then kind of blending it out, I went back over with C3 and just added some gray. So blending it with the C3 just kind of softens the transition between the colors. I'm applying another layer of C8 to kind of build that color up, and at no point do I actually use like special black or antique black or just straight up black on the cat. I'm using really dark grays to build up the impression that we have black. So I'm using C10 and just trying to delineate the shadows on the cat's fur. I'm also using C8 and then C10 to color the irises on the cat's eyes. So at this point, I'm just kind of picking things over, cleaning things up. For the mouths, I use Copic RV29 and a Winsor & Newton brush marker in M544. And I really want to impress upon you guys that brand loyalty is not important to me. I am not specifically loyal to just one brand. I'm not like a Copic enthusiast or a Blick Studio brush marker enthusiast. I use whatever colors and whatever brands work best for me. That's why you see me using a huge selection of markers here. Now, of course, that makes me intensely unappealing as someone for art companies to sponsor. So I am doing this of my own volition and with the help of my wonderful patrons on Patreon. So now that we're finished with the markers, we can go in with some white gouache, clean things up, add some highlights, add some sparkles to the eyes, and add some highlights to the leaves and to the flowers. And this is one of my favorite parts because this is when the illustration really starts to come to life. When you add the shinies to the eyes, that's when everything really seems to come together. And you don't have to use white gouache. You could use a white gel pen. You could use Copic Opaque White. You could use Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. You could even use a white Posca. It's really about what you enjoy using and what you're comfortable with using. And a lot of the techniques that I'm showing you here, they're going to work regardless of what brand of alcohol marker you're using. It's mostly about the brush, and it's mostly about the fact that there's an alcohol solvent. And regarding like adding the white, it's really in how you like to apply your highlights, how you like to apply your white outlines and your rim lighting and the sparkles in the eyes. So it's really about personal taste. So that wraps another alcohol marker tutorial up. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I really enjoyed marking this piece. Playing around with alcohol markers is so fun. This was really inspired by a unicorn piece I did testing out the sketch markers, and I had so much fun blending and coloring that I was like, I really gotta find a way to work more alcohol markers into my life. I've been doing so much watercolor and so much just black and white inked stuff that it was really fun to work with alcohol markers again and to get really saturated and yes, to get really anime inspired. I think she turned out absolutely adorable. If she asked me for anything, I would definitely wonder what her game is, because this kid is definitely out to manipulate you, sorry, with her super cute charms. And I really liked the colors for this one. This is very inspired by Daisy Kingdom, which I don't know about y'all, but as someone who grew up in the early 90s, my mom was forever stuffing me into frilly, flouncy Daisy Kingdom dresses. If y'all know what Daisy Kingdom is, let me know down in the comments below. I'm looking forward to meeting some other people who had a very similar childhood to mine. So I'm gonna have all of the colors listed out down in the description below, but like I said, you should pick your own colors. Just use this as inspiration. And I'm also going to have links to where you can buy the line art in the description as well. So thank you guys so much for watching. Have a happy Halloween, and I'll see you guys again soon. Bye guys!